Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm pitting Magnus against Martin, but I'm giving Martin 8 extra queens. The way I did this was I opened up 2 different games and I played Magnus's moves against Martin on one board, and then I responded with Martin's moves against Magnus on the other. And I'll tell you, the final result was pretty spectacular. I'll start off by explaining something that gives a lot of context to why this game played out the way it did, and that's the fact that this position right here is zugzwang. This is already losing for white. Everything that white plays in this position, this starting position, is forced checkmate. Just in this starting position, we already have queen takes f2 is checkmate in 1. So whatever white plays, whatever Magnus plays, has to stop that checkmate. And what Magnus chose to play was knight to h3, which to a human player seems like a decently natural defending move, but it's also pretty obvious that it walks into a remove the guard tactic, where after black takes on h3, white recaptures, and white loses to queen takes f2 checkmate. To a human player, that's pretty obvious, but what Magnus calculated was that after d4, there's a long sequence of moves before actual checkmate. Now, a human player in this position would play something a little more natural like pawn to e3. Feels more solid because it's a pawn, and it intercepts the checkmate altogether. Now, the reason that Magnus didn't play this is because there's a ridiculous engine line, as there always is, where black can sacrifice the queen on e3 with check. We can't recapture with the d-pawn because of queen takes d1, which is checkmate, so instead we recapture with the f-pawn. Black can sacrifice another queen on f1, and white is forced to recapture. Then black has checkmate in 2. With queen takes g2, white only has one move, and queen to h4 is checkmate. Now, would Martin ever see this combination? No. Martin could sit here for 100,000 years, sweat every sweat that his body can muster, and he would never see this combination. But Magnus doesn't know that. Magnus is just trying to play the move that makes the game last the longest. He's trying to survive for as long as possible. So instead of playing the natural e3, Magnus elects to play knight to h3 because, again, after queen takes and d4, it buys him a couple of extra moves before checkmate. Now, like we said, Martin has no idea about any of this. All of this is way over his head, so instead he plays queen to h5, simply developing one of his queens. And it's funny because Stockfish analyzes this game as Martin playing a lot of really good moves, because basically any move that develops a queen is a winning move. It creates more opportunities for checkmate. Martin doesn't know that, but Stockfish does. Magnus here replies with knight to c3, simply developing one of his pieces, and Martin responds by developing one of his own queens with queen to h4. Now, the natural move here for white would be to play something like g3 or e3, trying to make this kind of jagged pawn structure that's a little bit harder to penetrate than when all the pawns are just side by side. But the problem is what we mentioned. Everything here is zugzwang, right? g3 attacks a queen, but it hangs the rook on h1. e3 isn't great either. There's probably mating nets, but there's also a queen trade, which when you're already down 8 queens is probably not the best thing in the world. Even b3 in this position loses to queen takes c3, which you can't recapture because of that mate on d1. So instead, Magnus plays rook to g1, moving that rook off of the diagonal and preparing to play g3. Martin doesn't have a terribly good grasp of opening principles, so he moves a queen twice and moves it to c4, which again gets an evaluation of good move. But the truth is he doesn't know why it's a good move, and he doesn't have a plan to follow it up. Again, any queen move here that doesn't lose a queen basically sets up checkmate, one way or another. Martin doesn't know that. He plays queen to c4, and we all know in our hearts that that's just a random Martin move. Magnus plays pawn to g3, starting to create that kind of jagged pawn structure that's a little bit harder to break through. Martin responds with queen to g6, again, which gets a good move evaluation, but we know that Martin doesn't really know what he's moving. And Magnus plays knight to e4. And at this point, I'm not sure if I actually set up the Magnus bot or if this is actually Martin playing Martin, because obviously this is just a free knight. But this kind of ties back to what we were talking about before. Basically, every move in this position is losing. d3 doesn't threaten anything because of the pinned pawn, b3 is losing to losing the knight, and etc. for basically every move here on the board. The way that Stockfish evaluates this is -25, -30. Sometimes it flips over to mate in 7, sometimes it flips back. So the truth is that knight to e4, even though it gives up a free knight, it doesn't change that evaluation all that much. So for Magnus to play this is basically the same as for Magnus to play one of those other losing moves, since the engine evaluates that all moves here are basically losing. We get knight to e4, and Martin has been doing his free puzzle tactics and picks up the free knight. It looks like Magnus could play d3 here with a fork, but like we've talked about, there's still that queen takes d1 checkmate. So instead, white plays pawn to f3, threatens a queen for the first time in this game, which in my book is progress. Martin has too many queens to keep track of, so he plays queen to e7, ignoring the threat altogether, and Magnus accepts. Martin doesn't even bother to recapture. Instead, he plays queen to e5, centralizing one of his queens. Magnus responds with rook to b1, getting his rook off this diagonal, and again looking to consolidate his position. We get queen to f6 by Martin, finally looking for a mating threat on f2, where you've rediscovered that idea of removing the guard and then giving that checkmate. You could even take the rook on the way if you're extra fancy. And Magnus obviously sees this dilemma and has no other way to defend against it except to play rook to g2, which is unfortunate because it flat out hangs the knight, but Magnus thinks that Martin is going to see the removing the guard tactic and mate him. So he thinks he has no other choice than to play rook to g2 and defend that square. Martin has no idea about any of that and moves queen to d6, which actually inadvertently sets up bishop takes h3, but realistically he could have just taken it right away. Magnus plays pawn to d3 with his second threat, which isn't actually a threat, again because of that mate on d1. But what it does do for his position is it makes this kind of jagged pawn structure which is harder to break through, and he can maybe develop to f4, skewering the queens, move queen to d2, and he finally gets a little bit of piece mobility without losing right away. Martin sees none of that and plays queen back to e7, undeveloping one of his pieces, which is not the plan here whatsoever. And Magnus continues with his second real threat of a queen with knight to f4, looking to take that queen on h5. Martin develops one of his pieces, bishop to g7, and Magnus actually elects not to capture this queen. He plays bishop to d2 instead, which seems like a weird idea, but it makes perfect sense in hindsight. If we do the math on this quickly, let's say we did trade this knight for this queen because black would recapture, and we did that for all of our pieces. We traded this rook, and this rook, all for queens. Even if we were able to do that, we would end up in a position where this single queen and the rest of his pawns would have to take on all of these pieces that Martin has. Would it be possible to win that? Maybe, but the engine evaluates that he has more opportunities if he keeps pieces on the board than if he starts trading them off for queens. So Magnus instead plays bishop to d2, and what this does is it cuts off the original threat on d1, so this queen is actually under attack now. We have two threats on the board, which Martin addresses with bishop to d7, which does absolutely nothing but break up his own piece battery. Magnus, realizing this, accepts the queen on h5, and Martin doesn't even bother to recapture. Instead, he moves queen to a4, right into the line of a fork, and leaving two of his queens hanging, which Magnus accepts, with check on f6, and instead of even recapturing, Martin plays king to f7, activating his king like Martin usually does. Magnus retreats with knight to d5, centralizing his knight and threatening the queen on e7, and Martin plays queen to g6, leaving the queen hanging. Now this is where we start to see a little bit of engine play from Magnus, because a human here wouldn't even think about it, right? A human would say this knight has already captured two queens, let's make it a third on e7. But instead, Magnus says, look, I have one threat on c4, another threat on e7, let's make a third threat with pawn to b3. Now I'm threatening to take the queen on a4 and looking for the discovered attack on b7. Martin obviously sees all of these ideas and plays queen to e5, getting out of the way of this attack. And again, more engine play. A human here would say, look, I have two captures here that win a queen and unleash a discovered attack on b7. But instead, Magnus plays rook to f2 with an intermediate check. Martin has a couple of different ways to defend this check, namely with minor pieces or with one of his queens. Take a moment to guess how he did it. That's right, he moved one of his queens into the check. Magnus accepts this queen with knight takes f6, and instead of recapturing, Martin simply moves one of his queens randomly back, leaving his king on the same file as the knight. So anywhere this knight moves is discovered check. Magnus graciously accepts another free queen on a4, and Martin plays queen to c5, getting his queen out of danger, finally. Now here we see a super duper engine move by Magnus. He plays pawn to d4, which looks like it's just a free pawn. Black here could capture the pawn on d4, and Magnus's idea is to play e3, which looks like it makes no sense whatsoever. Because what we should have done to a human is capture this queen on b7 instead of playing that original d4 move. Now the issue here is that this line leads to lots and lots of different variations, but the good thing is that they all boil down to kind of the same idea. If you look closely, you'll notice that after d4 and e3, both of white's rooks are activated, the knight is well placed and ready to give a discovered check at any moment, both of the bishops can be activated in a moment's notice, and the queen after the d2 bishop can come out on the d file. And compared to Martin's position, where he has 4 queens and the rest of his pieces are undeveloped, this is actually really good for white. He's created a lot of tactical opportunities for his pieces and lots of ways to create counterplay, which to Magnus is more valuable than taking on b7 right away, which I think is really interesting. Surely Martin saw all of those ideas and decided to sacrifice the queen on c5 by playing knight to a6. Magnus graciously accepts the bishop on d7 with a discovered check, and after moving the king out of the way, he picks up another queen. We now have an attack on b7, a fork with that knight on c5, and our pieces are looking a lot more active. And we can take a moment to reflect on the fact that Martin only has 3 queens left, 2 of which are actually forked right now. Martin moves one of these queens to c6, and Magnus picks up the e6 queen instead. Here we see the final fatal move that Martin plays. At this point, there's still a chance that Martin can make a comeback because white's position is still a little bit awkward. Instead, Martin plays queen to f5, sacrificing the last extra queen that he had, all by himself. A human player in 1 zaptosecond would probably capture this queen, but Magnus is too fancy for that, so he takes a free bishop, forking the king and the queen. After king to e7, he finally picks up that extra queen, and Martin plays queen to g6, making no attempt at developing any of these pieces. Magnus capitalizes on the fact that he's finally equalized and is now actually up material by 11 points, and starts looking for mating threats. He plays rook to b7 check, and I find this particular sequence particularly elegant because it drags the king out all the way to the center. I mean, he really rubs it in his face. We already see that these pieces are undeveloped, and the king is the only thing in the center, but Magnus makes an extra good point of that by playing e5 check after king to d6, dragging the king out even further into the center. Now, I assume Martin is happy because it seems that he's always trying to develop his king to the center, but unfortunately it brings about checkmate in a couple of moves. Magnus plays c4 check, drags the king out even further into the position, and after e3 check, the king retreats to the only square, and Magnus sees queen to f3 checkmate, ending the game. I really enjoyed making this video. If you guys want to see more of this, let me know down in the comments below. Maybe I can try with 15 queens or 12 queens or something different. If you guys did enjoy this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.